It is Saturday, August 22nd, and I am here with Pastor Christopher Nilsson, who's been married for 32 years, five beautiful children, two grandchildren, and is a pastor who has been a senior pastor since 1993, which is 27 years and counting. Um, I personally want to share that I had the privilege of meeting Pastor Christopher through a good friend, his daughter Christina, and have been in some ways awestruck since that meeting. I'm always appreciative of people who can carry conversations in depth, and truly have a sense of civic duty and what it means to build one's community, and what family values and just truly having compassion for others looks like. And as a result, for this first video, which focuses on why vote, I did invite him and ask him to share some of his thoughts with regard to statements and questions that will be presented. Um, you know, a lot of people are saying in November, this is the biggest election yet. And when we reflect, that phrase is said often, almost every year, and in various elections. But Pastor Christopher, if you can open up by sharing a little bit more about yourself, if you so desire, as well as letting the viewers who will be watching this know or who may be listening in, why is this election one of the most important if you feel that that's the case?
Uh, Thank you, Sister Stephanie. In terms of sharing a little bit more about myself, I think you've done a pretty good job there. Um, so I'll go right into the question. Why is this the most important election yet? I do believe that that is true. Um, I think that's true for a number of reasons. In American politics, we have become further and further uh, separated into silos, into tribes. That's another term that's being used. And because of that, uh, the fringe segments of the parties are talking, and it's become an either or environment. It's no longer mutually exclusive. It's no longer um, compromise. So it's an all or nothing. It's a zero sum game mentality, so to speak. So increasingly, the the elections, such as this general election that's coming up, and such as 2016, becomes an all or nothing for both sides. And when both sides speak, it's pretty much, if the other side wins, it's the end of the world. And so and it's the way politics has developed. You are hearing the apocalyptic ending that one side is prescribing or prophesying about the other side. The more colorful, I think, you're hearing the Democrats basically saying that democracy is at stake. American democracy, America as we know it, is at stake. And then on the other side, you hear the Republicans saying that, to use the words of Trump, that Biden will hurt the Bible, that Biden will hurt God, um, uh, that if the Democrats take over, America will be destroyed. So you have two polar opposites and sides, and both sides are making the same claim. So because of that, it makes, depending on where one sits, what camp one is in, or what one is looking for, that this election is really the most important in our lifetime. And I would certainly venture to say, um, in the last several decades,
Hmm.
even beyond our lifetime.
So considering that point, what I shared with you before, in the last few years especially, I've tried to challenge young people in questions and, just listening to them why, they don't feel interested in voting and why, they don't vote at all or they don't necessarily have plans to vote. And some of the answers that I receive are like, my one vote is not going to make a difference. Um, you know, I always am told choose the lesser of two evils, but they both seem evil in some form of fashion. You hear sometimes neither reflect my values and or will really meet my needs because everybody's just saying what we want to hear right now. But as soon as they get into office, you know, it's the change. There's going to be a change in tune. They're going to do whatever they were originally planning. Um, when I did vote in the past, my person still didn't win. And some of the responses back have been in encouraging them, as well as I've seen in social media and people talking and posting have been, well, first and foremost, you should vote because a lot of people risked their lives and or died for you to have an opportunity to vote, that it is your right to vote. And by voting, you will ensure that that right is secured. Sometimes for me, a personal thought is more of, I am my brother's or sister's keeper. So in that case, when you're voting, you should consider, the community at large. What would your response be to young people or even adults, young people who've never voted or may have considered registering to vote and are still on the fence, or maybe on the opposite, people who are much older and have kind of given up on this ideology that your vote counts and your voice counts and you make a difference?
Boy, you ask a very layered and a very complicated question that I'm not sure how much time I have to answer that question, but I'm going to try to see if I can address the different aspects and the different layers, and maybe if I forget some of those points, you remind me. But
Absolutely.
a lot of thoughts came to my mind in response to that question. Number one is to consider that in the last election, for instance, I'm referring to the last general election, in some of the states, one party, the winner, only won by a fraction of votes, very, very small number of votes. And in many of those states, the vote would have been easily swung to the other direction had there just been a few people that voted who did not vote. Overall, we know that in the last general election, roughly about over 100 million or so, and I'm not exactly sure about that number, but I believe I'm accurate with that. About 100 million or so people did not vote, and the winner, who did not win the popular vote, won by virtue of the Electoral College. But had those 100 million dispersed in various states voted, then you very well and very, very much could have had a different outcome. You also have a lot of competitions or voting races that go to recounts, and where persons are winning by a very small number of votes when you get into small localities, or even a larger in terms of municipalities. So the whole concept of one person's vote is very, very important, because you also have the multiplicative effect. which is
Okay.
if each person says my vote doesn't count, and you get 10 people that say that, then that's 10 votes that now are not counting, which
Yeah.
really they do count. And then if you multiply that exponentially to 1,000 and to 1,000,000, then you get this multiplicative effect, because everybody else is saying the same thing. So really, it boils right back down to that one vote. It boils right back down to that one person, because each of us has to take that responsibility, that civic duty, if you will, to participate. And too many, and I believe one is too many. Too many of
Mm-hmm.
us are not participating. Now, the other, so we address the issue of the importance of the vote in terms of affecting the outcome. But let's also look at the importance of the vote in understanding the political structure. If, you know, the political structure is such, and the way that our system is set up, you have balance of power, so to speak. And what oftentimes happens is that if one does not vote, there can be an effect, let's say, between the House of Representatives, and this can be state as well as federal or
Mm-hmm.
the nationwide. You have the House of Representatives, you have Congress, and you have the Senate, you have the House of Representatives, and then you have the President. And you also have the Supreme Court. They all check and balance each other, but at the same time, the influence comes out of the vote. So in other words, for instance, let's just say the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court, the justices are selected by the president, and they go through the Congress, but the president gets to select his or her person. So whoever the president is has a lot to do with who gets selected to the Supreme Court.
Mm-hmm.
When you talk about, determining the budget, the House will set that, but it also has to be approved by the Senate, and the quagmire that you're having right now in government is that one party controls one house, one chamber, the other party controls the other,
Mm-hmm.
and they are not meeting. So one can pass and the other one will not.
Yeah.
Or let's take it even on a more local level. You have a situation where say in Philadelphia, the municipal government, the mayor, city council, and so forth, they're running the city, but at the same time, they're answerable to the state. So funding that comes to the city from the state. And if the state is controlled by another party, then that affects what happens with the city. And so in terms of the city, there, the issue of funding for schools that has been an issue that's age old. Even the city of the issue of gun control, where Philadelphia has tried to make laws for gun control, and the state says no, you don't have the right to do that. So all of these levels is to be able to understand that if you don't vote, you actually aid and abet the quagmire that's there, the bottlenecking that's there. And so very little is able to be done in terms of what your needs are, or in terms of what your concerns are. So you have to vote, and your vote expresses those concerns. Your vote provides power, so to speak, in terms of getting what it is that you want to get done. And you can drill this down all the way down to being a part of the school board and voting for who sits on the school board, because that determines the direction of the school district, or whatever school district you belong to, and that affects the quality of education. It affects the style of education. It affects the books that are used. It affects the curriculum or curricula that are used. And so you have to understand that if you don't vote, someone else votes, then your choice is not made, and the very things that you complain about are the very things that will systematically and systemically continue, simply because you're not participating. And so if you feel powerless and you don't vote, you even become more powerless. It becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy that's there. So it's all of those layers, understanding how politics works, and also understanding how voting works, because these things are extremely important in deciding the course of macroscopically and at a larger level the nation, but also affects the municipality, the city, affects locally your community. It affects everything. So voting is extremely important. It is I believe it is John Lewis who just passed, who that basically made the point that voting is the most powerful weapon. It is the bedrock of democracy. It is the most powerful weapon that democracy has. It is the one thing that you have, that you and I have, that we have, that can make a difference. And in terms of the parties, as I indicated, because they're so polar opposite now, there is a significant difference between the parties. I know a lot of people say that there is no difference. There is a significant difference in policy. There's a significant difference in priorities. And so one has to learn about these priorities. One has to learn about these differences and ask yourself the question: is this party focusing on my needs or not? Which party is doing that?
And okay, so in touching on your last statement, and again, neither of us need to share what party we belong to, but I know when it comes to primaries in particular, it's important to choose a party. And you actually touched on everything I was inquiring or mentioning before with regard to the responses from people who don't vote, because some people mention neither fit the view. And so would you agree that that is true, no matter what party you align yourself with, that not every member of that political party may represent all of your values or thoughts, and not every campaign that they choose to seek after will align 100% with your views or thoughts, but it is important to really learn about both and choose the one that reflects most of what you believe, or overall the direction you feel that the country or the world needs to go. Or if you want to just keep it simple and personal, that the choices and their voting average and direction will not harm your family or yourself in the current or near future.
In terms of whether or not the parties are different, the parties are different. I mean, they are very, very different. The Republican platform and the Democratic platform are extremely different, and they're becoming even more so polarized. So to say that it's the same is not only not true, but one has to really learn. One has to really get information on what the parties stand for. Um, without trying not to show any bias to any particular party, but the Republican Party is a party that pretty much is its standard bearing is small government. It doesn't want government to be very much involved in lives. Its platform is small government. Its platform is more capitalistic model, free market enterprise, um, giving what they call the producers or the manufacturers or the people that are the leaders, giving them an opportunity to spread their wings, and as a result of their brilliance, so to speak, that everybody else would benefit, that all boats will rise, kind of a thing. A part of their platform also is family values, so to speak, and these are speaking points for them in terms of law and order, in terms of a strong military, and in terms of how America is seen on the foreign international scene. While you have with the Democrats, you have a belief in building from the bottom up. So with the Republicans, you're going from the top down. With the Democrats, you're coming from the bottom up. And again, this is their platform, and that government plays a significant role in that, particularly when you get into persons, middle, lower class, poor, that need the involvement of government to be able to give them a standard of living, so to speak, and allowing for government to provide the services that everybody needs, whether it be medical services, or services, essential services, that those should be provided by government, and take the private enterprise out of it. So the concept of family values is more so broadening that concept and recognizing the definition of family is not as narrow as the Republicans would make it. So you get into things as marriage equality, the woman's right to abortion, and you get into those kinds of things. So those are, you have some stark differences within. Now, of course, within each party, you have variations of these positions, but by and large, that's, when you look at it, pulling back, those are the positions that are taken. In terms of a person, voting for a person versus a party, to say, well, does this particular person align with my belief or not? By and large, I think, for the most part, people align with their party. And if you are running representing a particular party, at some point, though, the party platform is essentially what you're going to end up espousing, and you're going to end up representing. It's not that often that you get an individual character who runs on their own and basically is running regardless as to what their party platform is. Simply because the way politics works in terms of needing to be promoted, needing the backing, needing the funding, unless one has your own means. And that's one of the reasons why you're having the phenomenon now of wealthy individuals that are running with their own money. I mean,
Yeah.
outside of that option, every individual needs the backing of the party and needs the backing of someone to run. So if they are running and they're needing that, then they're beholden to that. So I'm not sure how much option one has to say I am voting for the person as opposed to the party, because they're inextricably interwoven.
I appreciate that. Part of your answer before also touched on the next question or thought related to why it's important to vote. And so I'll give an example which actually connects to something you said. Funding for education. In my review and research, it was stated that education funding comes from the state and federal candidates and the local school board. So you mentioned who we elect or vote in that make up the school board will impact the distribution of funds, the type of education a person's child will have in the community. Affordable housing is city, state, and federal candidates. Criminal justice is judges and prosecutors. Affordable health care, state and federal candidates. Parks and recreation, along with local taxes, zoning, and land use, along with senior services and library operations, are all part of or all led or controlled by county and city candidates. And then last but not least, but a big topic now is with regard to gun control, and that is by state and federal candidates. Now, the next part we'll talk about specifically when it comes to criminal justice, but before I even touch on that, which will include things like the no-knock warrant, chokehold bill, the crime bill that more people are paying more attention to, that Biden was connected to as an example. Do you have any comments to these various candidates or people of power who are controlling and regulating the fundings for these different things that impact you and I, our families, and the community?
Yes, I'll address it on two different levels. One, with regards to, and in some respects, reiterate what I said earlier, is to understand that some things are at a. Let's talk about Philadelphia here. Some things are Philadelphia has control over, and some things Philadelphia doesn't have control over. Again, you talk about education, the funding and the funding formula. The funding, much of it is coming from the state, not all of it. Yes. In Philadelphia, some of it, if I'm not mistaken, some of it also comes through, I think the utility. I think the gas company does that, or it's transportation. One of them. But a huge chunk of the funding. And through city council. City council, I believe, also provides some funding for the school. But the major chunk of the funding is coming from the state. And the state is also determining the formula that calculates how much the city gets. So the city is not the one that's controlling this. And until recently, for several years, it was the state that also, it was a state board that ran Philadelphia's school district. So even in that, in that regard, the city had nothing to do with, had no control over its own school district. So yes, it is important to have a say in who is on the school board. And the school board, the makeup of the school board, there's a formula for that in terms of, I think the mayor has, is able to select so many people, and I don't remember what the composition has to be. But some things are Philadelphia and some things are not. Now, in terms of your vote, however, the vote across the state, you're not, if you live in Philadelphia, you're not going to be able to control the vote in another county. Mm-hmm. You're not going to be able to do that. However, you do control the vote that's taking place in terms of the general representation in terms of the senators and the congresspersons that go to Congress. And Pennsylvania in particular has been highlighted as being one of those states that has engaged in excessive gerrymandering. And I don't know if people are familiar with the concept of gerrymandering, but what gerrymandering does is essentially manipulate the map in such a way that it works in your favor. So let me see if I can explain this in a nutshell. If you have 10 people that vote a particular way, and 8 live in a particular geographic region, and 2 live in another geographic region, and you want to you already have the party that's in power already has a control of the geographic region that has the 2. So they don't need that geographic region because they already know that they're going to win that district. So so you need those 2 to come over with the 8 in order to create a geographic region that gives you a very good chance of winning. So what you do is you draw the map in such a way that you go over to where those 2 people are living, and the map stretches over to them, and if you look at the map, it could be the weirdest thing you will ever see, but they'll go over to those 2, circle them, and bring them back into this new geographic region, so that now you have this region whereby you don't have 8, but you have 10. Mm-hmm. So you've drafted them into the 10. So what you have across, for instance, Pennsylvania, and I'll use this for an example, is that the Pennsylvania House of Representatives and Senate, in Pennsylvania, the vote, as this is for an example, the 2018, overwhelmingly was Democratic, but the representatives in the Pennsylvania House and the Senate are still controlled by Republicans. Why? Because of gerrymandering. Okay, so gerrymandering negates the number of votes. Okay, the volume of votes. So people will say, okay, if gerrymandering, then therefore my vote doesn't count. Truly, that's exactly what gerrymandering does. Gerrymandering renders your vote useless. But you've got to understand that gerrymandering is a result of votes. In other words, those who get to draw the districts are drawn with the census every 10 years. And it is the party that's in power that gets to draw the districts and gets to determine where they gerrymander. So if one party is particular, then it gerrymanders in its favor. So right now, because the Republicans have been in control, they gerrymandered, even though the courts had struck it down and the courts had asked them to ordered them to redraw it, as a matter of fact. But even with that, and this is, Pennsylvania is not that different than many other states across the country, whereby the popular vote has been overwhelmingly Democratic, but or for the Democrats, but the assembly, the state, still is controlled by Republicans, and that is because of gerrymandering. So gerrymandering renders your vote useless, but it is your vote that puts a party in power that causes them and enables them to gerrymander.
So to your point, your response does not suggest at all that people should accept defeat or feel so discouraged they stop voting, but instead not only remain determined to vote, but challenge other people who vote similar to the way they think, or just have an issue with how the gerrymandering occurs, that they should speak up not just by complaining, but in their voting practices.
Yes,
Would that be
absolutely, and well, it requires actually voting, and it also requires advocacy and the need to speak up, and other means by which the gerrymandering issue has gone to courts. They've gone to courts throughout the country on this, but these. This is a tactic, and there are other tactics that are used to suppress the vote and to dampen down the enthusiasm gap or the enthusiasm of persons to vote. Now, when somebody is working overtime, and this is what people need to understand, that parties are working overtime to get you not to vote. There is an enormous amount of strategy. There is an enormous amount of money. There is an enormous amount of effort that's put into getting you not to vote. And so when you don't vote, you are, the 2016 election, and I'm giving you findings. So I'm not picking on any party, but I'm giving you the finding. On the 2016, one of the things that the Russians did, bipartisan, I've said this, is basically that they were able to discourage people to vote, particularly people of color. That they were able to run things on social media, stories that were not true, but what they basically did was discourage people from voting. Now, if somebody's trying to discourage you from voting, that in itself ought to let you know how important the vote is.
Matters. Yes, I would agree. I would absolutely agree. And with that, I will just plug in a reminder that our election day for Pennsylvania is Tuesday, November 3rd, this year. If you still need to register to vote, you can register online by Monday, October 19th. You can also register by mail, but you must make sure it's postmarked by October 19th. And there are select areas where you can actually go in person to register to vote. I also want to give, whether we call it cheap or not, a plug for the census, the U.S. Census, because you touched on that. And a lot of people don't understand the importance or don't recognize that the validity or the impact that completing the U.S. Census can make. And I will say this, that although I'm a big proponent on voting in some cases it's every year or every 4 years. The U.S. Census, as you already mentioned, is only done every 10 years, every decade. And so when you don't lend your voice to the U.S. Census, which also impacts, in some cases, from a zoning standpoint, how funding is distributed. Because if you're not counted, they won't factor you in when it comes to how much they're going to provide in funding for healthcare and for education and for things as simple as tax, not just tax collection, but garbage collection. You know, and that can all impact us, not just for, again, a year or 4 years, but for the next decade. And so if you miss the opportunity now, then you're waiting 10 years before you can support in one form or fashion again. And in addition to that, unlike other options with the US Census, they encourage not just the majority or the minority, but they will also factor in undocumented workers to ensure that they're counted as well, so they know how to assist from an immigration standpoint. Now, I'm not saying how people should view immigration or how it should be approached. I'm just simply being honest to the fact that the US Census will count that group of people, because they need to know in order to ensure that the right support and services are being allocated to the right areas and demographics.
Correct.
So
And I would say it's not just undocumented workers. It's just it's undocumented. Period. It counts. The U.S. Census does not discriminate or should not discriminate, and does not discriminate in who is counted. The whole idea is to capture everybody. The need to know who is in the United States, the makeup of who is in the United States, and so on and so forth, regardless as to one's immigration status.
Going back to criminal justice. So with regard to the no-knock warrant, that warrant or approach is what is being scrutinized even further currently, and it's partially because of Breonna Taylor. I think she was 26 years old, March 13th of this year. She was shot and killed because a group of police officers entered into her home with this warrant, which meant that they didn't have to knock or introduce themselves or announce who they were, and she lost her life. And a number of people, or many people, especially those who are connected to Black Lives Matter, truly believe it's murder, or it was murder. And that's the reason why, and Pennsylvania is one of the states that is actually proposing a Breonna law. So after her own name, in order to shed light and hope that this never happens again. But in just researching, because I knew that this had happened before, I learned that Ayanna Monet Stanley Jones, hyphenated, 7-year-old young lady from Detroit's East Side, May 16, 2010. So about 10 years before, similar thing happened where the home was shot up and the 7-year-old was killed. In that case, the police officers, particularly one, were on trial actually for manslaughter. Ultimately, they were never charged because it was thrown out. They tried to retrial it, and then by the third time, I don't believe they did. But that was young Ayanna, who this year, ironically, would have been 17 years old and of age to vote, or near the age to vote. Katherine Johnston is another person, an elderly woman, November 21st, 2006, in Atlanta, Georgia. Police entered her home under a similar warrant. And this elderly woman, because she questioned and felt someone was breaking into her home, as one article noted, she actually shot first, because she's like, I don't know who you are, you're breaking in, to defend herself. Fire was returned by the police, and I believe she was shot like 5 or 6 times, but a total of like 30 plus bullets were found in the home as return fire. Her family sued and received like maybe a little over 4 million in a lawsuit years later. But these are just 3 cases related to the no-knock warrant, which could experience severe change or remain the same depending on how our judges and prosecutors view and apply their, their judgment, and that is impacted by voting.
Yes.
Yes. The chokehold bill, which unfortunately was made infamous by George Floyd earlier this year, who most of us watched for that 8-minute period, as he was lying on the floor crying for aid and help, and stating that he could not breathe. And that did not persuade, the officer who was kneeling on his neck as he was handcuffed on the ground, to cease doing so. And he ultimately died. And unfortunately, there have been cases prior to him, and actually after George Floyd, but at least one case before him, which also garnered attention, was ironically Eric Garner in 2014, where in one article it mentions that he also noted at least once that he could not breathe. And so yet another bill or approach related to criminal justice that is impacted by our voting practices, that is impacted by those who are currently in office and how they view the laws and how they choose to enforce, adjust, revitalize them. So what I would say to you, Pastor Chris, if those 2 laws as examples, and some of the outcomes or results or the tragedies associated with them upset people, anger people, what is the expectation then when it comes to how they vote, not just this year, but in the future?
I will start off by saying that, you cited a lot of unknown accounts, which are very much similar to the more celebrated incidents that we have. The truth of the matter, is that these incidents, the George Floyds, the Eric Garners, the Breonna Taylors, that have filled our consciousness, are very much, unfortunately, typical. In Black and brown communities, and so it does. The issue is not that these incidents were abnormal or out of the ordinary. It was really more so that they were caught on tape, and that the tapes were not destroyed, or the tapes were did not fall in the wrong hands, so to speak. That's more the what's at work here. There are many Eric Garners and George Floyds,
Unfortunately, yes,
that have happened and continue to happen in our communities, particularly in Black and brown communities, and Breonna Taylor's. To your point and to your question of how does voting fit into all of this? Voting fits, again, very much into this, directly and indirectly, because the judicial system, the judges, and the judicial system is a large system. From all the way from the Supreme Court coming all the way down, to local judges. In some of them, there are some municipalities, there are some areas where judges are directly elected. So that's where voting can directly impact who is going to be the judge. And here in Philadelphia, there are many judgeships that are determined by election. So election plays a direct role in determining who is the judge, who's going to be the judge. That's not always the case. But then you also have the other side, which is that the judges are appointed, but they're appointed by who is in office. So therefore, your vote determines who gets to choose. And as I indicated before, for instance, if you look at the Supreme Court, the current president, Donald Trump, has been able to appoint 2. Now, it's interesting how he has been able to appoint 2 of the 9 justices. One of them, he became available because one justice decided to step down, and Justice Kavanaugh was appointed to fill his slot, so to speak. There's a lot of question as to why that judge decided to step down. Mm-hmm. But the other, which was an unforeseen, unexpected death, happened under Obama. But because, again, going back to the vote, because the Senate was controlled by the Republicans, the Speaker, McConnell, was able to block it. Not even bring it up for discussion, not even bring it up for a vote. Almost for a full year, just block it, and just waited until, no one knew who was going to be the new president, but in essence blocked it until a new president came in. And all of that has to do with voting. Okay, it has to do with voting. This administration, I think, one of the greatest impacts of this administration will be and is the judiciary. Donald Trump loses in November will not affect the number of judges that he has already appointed, and at a breakneck speed. In the 3.5 or 3 3/4 years that Donald Trump has been president, between Donald Trump and the Senate, they have at a breakneck speed rammed through literally hundreds of judges, lifetime appointments, which means that they don't come off the bench for the rest of their lives. Lifetime appointment. It's not just the Supreme Court that's lifetime appointment. You have literally hundreds, thousands of other judiciary judges across the country that are lifetime appointments. And these judges are appointed by the party that's in power. So in essence, your vote is a key role in determining who gets appointed. There is a direct line. There is a direct relationship between your vote and who gets to be the judge. And that can either be directly in terms of whether you are voting for the judge, because there's, as I said, there's some judgeships that are determined by vote, and then there are others that are determined by appointment. So voting is the bedrock, is the key, is the foundation, is the determining factor for who sits on the bench.
So with that, there's been a lot of discussion with regard to whether or not people should be allowed to vote by mail. And, with, the current administration, there have been statements that, voting by mail cannot be trusted. We also have, and this is in some ways connected but completely different with regard to the U.S. Post Office and how, at this point it may be shut down completely. And if that were to occur before November, voting by mail would not even be, will not look the way it does now, or may not even be able to happen. And so I know the popularity with voting by mail as I was growing up was it normally happened for people who were elderly or who knew that they were, not going to be maybe in the country or in the area at that time. So they would select that option to ensure that their vote was cast, their voice was heard, and not miss out. Many of us, such as myself, would vote right before you go to work, vote right after or afterward, because you don't have the option. It's not like it's a national holiday, although that's been a topic for some now, but it's not currently a national holiday where everyone has off so they could happily, go to vote whenever they would like. And so I'm interested to hear your thoughts regarding the new proposals for and against voting by mail, and if you feel that they do correlate with maybe the strategies of some, to suppress the vote or enhance the number of people who actually vote.
Well, to me, it's a no-brainer. I mean, the president of the United States has indicated why, directly, why he doesn't want voting by mail, because he feels that voting by mail will give him a lesser chance of winning. I mean, that's not my opinion. Those are his words. So clearly, the efforts to undermine, to sabotage, if you will, the post office, the efforts, the reasons for that are clear and without question and without doubt. Voting by mail is not new. Voting by mail has been around for as long as we've been voting. There have been a lot of semantics being thrown around, absentee voting as opposed to voting by mail. I don't know what the difference is. It's the same thing.
Just vote.
Yeah, it's just voting by mail. Now, the reasons may be, absentee, with absentee, usually I think you may have to give a reason why the case may be, but the reason why more people would be needing to vote by mail is obvious. We are living in a new normal. We are living in a pandemic, and so that naturally makes it necessary to make voting by mail a viable option, because you certainly, not, and it's not just from the perspective that people may not want to go to the polls to vote, but it is also from the perspective that you may not have enough people who are working the polls. So, because the truth of the matter is a lot of the people that work the polls, tend to be of a particular demographic. And therefore you may just not have enough staffing to do that. So, it makes absolute common sense that one will make voting by mail, ramping that up as a viable option for persons to participate in the democracy.
So last but not least is a question with regards to why people should vote. And so I'll leave it to you as a brown Black man who is married with children and grandchildren. So you are not just thinking of today or even tomorrow, but the future, because the future has to be bright for your children and the grandchildren you have currently and the ones to come. And also as a faith-based leader, from a Christian standpoint, may possibly speaking to the church, what are your final statements, or what last statement would you like to share with the audience as a way to challenge a father or a male who has never voted, or who has given up on the idea of it, a person who again wants to see, like, who is focused on the future because you have loved ones who need a brighter and better future to come. And then also from the faith-based standpoint, for the church specifically, why should these entities or groups strongly reconsider if their decision is already that they're not going to register to vote or vote, and if they're unsure, like, what encouragement would you share with them, or piece of advice to challenge them to vote?
Let me take the second part first, in terms of responding to this as from a faith-based perspective. I believe as Christians 100% that we need to be voting and to be participants as citizens, and a civic responsibility to really exercise our civic responsibility. It runs the full gamut of the scriptures, from the Old Testament to the New Testament. In the Old Testament, you have justice, the whole concept of justice being at the very center of the proclamation of the prophets. It's the message of the prophets. Justice. There needs to be justice. There needs to be justice and righteousness. And back then you're dealing in a theocracy, so they're talking to the people, and God speaks to the king, and basically says throughout the Psalms and Proverbs, make sure you take care of the poor. Make sure you take care of the last, the least, and the lost. Make sure that you do that. And so that theme is constant and recurs. And so in our, if you will, Judeo-Christian tradition, the whole concept of justice is the bedrock, is the very center of who we are. So today, in today's contemporary setting, the way that we are able to achieve justice is through advocating for it, and yes, through voting, because that is the system in which we find ourselves in. So that's very important, because when you get into the New Testament, you have a few examples that definitely speak to the fact of our engagement. You have the example in of course with Jesus responding to the question, who do we pay tribute to? Should we pay tribute to Caesar, so to speak, in Matthew the 22nd chapter. It's also in Luke, I think Luke 20, and in Mark 11 or 12. That same incident is there. And Jesus's response is, give to Caesar what is Caesar's, and give to God what is God's.
Yeah.
And there are a number of interpretations out there. As far as I'm concerned, they're all highfalutin. Most of them are highfalutin in terms of, one interpretation is what Jesus was really saying is that Caesar is subservient to God, and therefore, even though this is Caesar's inscription, Caesar belongs to God, and that this was an issue with respect to whether or not to worship Caesar. I don't think that either one of those was an issue at all. I think the text is what the text says what the text says.
Yes.
The question was, should we be paying taxes to Caesar or not? And the issue was that to catch Jesus and to box him into there were two answers that they thought he could give. They thought that there were only two answers he could give. One answer would be yes, to pay taxes to Caesar, and the other answer would be no, not to pay taxes to Caesar. Okay, it was a very, very sly, a very, very crafty question, and they knew that either one they would have been able to box him in. So, had he said yes to pay taxes to Caesar, then it would have put him on the side of Rome against the Israelites and the people who were, paying the taxes and didn't want to pay the taxes. That's why the tax collectors were hated so much. Okay, so if he said yes, the people would have been against him, and if he said no, the authorities would have been against him, because then they would have been able to say, see, to the authorities, he is he is inciting insurrection. He is saying, don't obey you. Okay, so that's what the issue was. Jesus ends up really saying neither. What Jesus, or both, if you want to look at it another way, what Jesus really ends up saying is say, look, the things that are Caesar's, give to him that. The things that are God, give to him that. Now, how do I interpret that as it relates to us as citizens participating in our civic responsibility? It lets us know that as Christians, we are both citizens of the kingdom of God, but we need to also understand that we're grounded and we're citizens right where we are now.
So the concept of not in the world, but not of the world. So understanding that, there, would you say kind of that we, as for Christians, that you have to be considering both earth and kingdom at the same time when you do what you do?
Absolutely. As a matter of fact, I'm not sure if in of the world and not of the world would be a good characterization in this context. In this context, it would be in the world and of the world, meaning to say that we as citizens, we have to exercise our civic responsibilities as citizens now. And what Jesus is saying is that we as individuals, there are things that belongs to God that we must pay homage to God. But as human beings, there are things that belong to the government that we must also have the responsibility of. And we see this playing out, for instance, in the book of Romans, where Paul talks about, obeying the government and paying taxes in Romans chapter 13. Also kind of communicated as another verse in Peter, 2 Peter, I think, too, round about there. So Paul is basically saying, look, the government has a particular role that God has ordained. Okay, so God has ordained the role of the government. God is interested in the government. God has established the government and has appointed the government, so to speak, to do good. Okay, so in essence, the attitude of Christians that I shouldn't have anything to do with government is to me nonsensical, because already we're being told that God appoints and God has a role to play in who government is, and that God has made government so that it takes care of people, that it does good, that government does good. So in essence, God himself is a fan of government. Okay, so for us to disassociate ourselves from government is incongruent and inconsistent with that. Okay, another example we have is in the book of Acts, the 22nd chapter, and there we find where Paul is saved from the mob. at the temple, and he's saved by the tribune and by the authorities. They don't know what's going on. There's just an uproar. They went to investigate what's going on. They realized that, you know, the crowd was beating up this man to death. They yanked him out of the crowd, but, you know, they wanted to find out what was going on. And the tribune, in order to get answers from Paul, decides to interrogate him by beating him. And when he ties him up to beat him, Paul says, wait a minute now, are you aware that I'm a Roman citizen? Okay. And Paul knew exactly what he was doing. Because the truth of the matter is, you couldn't beat a Roman citizen without cause. You couldn't put a Roman citizen in that position. And that frightened the living daylights out of the tribune. The tribune ended up going to the centurion, basically saying, you know what's going on here? You know that he's that he's a Roman citizen? And the tribune was shaking in his boots, including the other people that were going to exact the punishment on Paul. And the reason for that is that they knew, had they started to beat him, they would have been in violation, serious violation of Roman law and Roman rule. And so what you have here is Paul exercising his civic right, so to speak. Okay, exercising his civic right as a Roman citizen. The tribune bought his Roman citizenship. He was not even born as a Roman citizen. Paul was. Okay, so what we have here is that we as Christians, if you will, we have dual citizenship. We have citizenship in heaven. Our citizenship is in heaven, Paul says, but we also have citizenship here on earth, and we have the responsibility to both. The citizenship in heaven is that we have giving to God what is God's. And the citizenship here on earth is giving to Caesar what is Caesar's. And basically operating, if we are going to establish God's kingdom here on earth. And that is part of what we're doing. That is part of what we as Christians ought to be doing, is to let his will be done, which is on earth as it is in heaven. If we are going to do that, part, not all, voting is not the only way, but part of it is voting. Part of it is being engaged in civic responsibility. I mean, it also includes protest. It also includes speaking aloud and sparing not. It includes advocacy. For me as a preacher, it includes preaching from the pulpit. It includes living our lives in a particular way, letting our light so shine before people that they may see our good works and glorify God the Father who is in heaven. So we clearly have a mandate to bring about the will of God, to bring about justice. And one of the ways that we do that is through the ballot box. It's not 100%, foolproof. It is not perfect. None of these measures is perfect, but it is one of the means by which we exercise our God-given responsibility and response to being God's children here on earth. As a father, as a black, brown, Caribbean, American, immigrant, all of these things speak to the whole issue of justice. It speaks to immigrant justice. It speaks to racial justice. It speaks to gender justice, because I have a wife and I have 4 daughters, who are right now being paid less, who face glass ceilings, who face discrimination in the workplace. So all of these issues become front and center. Environmental justice, as a minority, the dumping the waste that is released in the air near our communities, the fact that our communities are more susceptible to all of the things that are happening with climate change or environmental change, so all of these things, health, the pandemic disproportionately affecting Black and brown, either by way of, people can't stay home and work. They have to go out and work and take public transportation, not having health insurance or good health insurance. And so coming down with the illness, not able to combat it properly. So all of these things are justice issues. And they affect me as a male, as a minister, as a minority, as an immigrant. They affect me in all of these phases. And so to be engaged in the civic process and to be engaged in voting and the likes is of paramount importance.
With that, Pastor Christopher, I just want to thank you again for joining, speaking so much truth. I appreciate you, and I believe those who will listen to the recording will also appreciate you. If someone was interested in having a dialogue with you directly or had questions for you prior to next month, are you comfortable with them corresponding to you via email or phone? And if so, can you share your information?
Absolutely. My email is the one long word, and I've had people laugh at me and make fun of my email address, but it is one long word, The Living Church Filler. TheLivingChurch, Filler is short for Philadelphia, PHILA. The Living Church Filler at yahoo.com. Okay. Send me an email. I'll be more than happy to respond to that. I really do appreciate this opportunity, this forum to be able to share, and looking forward to the next segment. And certainly also welcome any persons having any questions or comments or any responses to what I've said thus far.
Thank you very much, and enjoy your weekend.
Thank you.
Pastor Christopher Nilsson, always a pleasure.
Thank you. Same here. God bless.
God bless you.